Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the third round of the European Team Chess Championships being held in Budva, Montenegro. Now as we know, Norway has struggled at the start. They lost a very tough match yesterday to Austria, and Magnus Carlsen himself barely drew the game. But on the plus side, after having lost, it looked like they would get a much easier pairing today, playing against the great country of Iceland. So let's jump right into the action. So of course we have Magnus Carlsen, the former world chess champion, or former world champion, former 5-time winner. I know people in comments have said that it's incorrect or whatever, so I'm trying to change it up a little bit. But we have Magnus Carlsen playing against Hjorvar Steingrimsson from Iceland. Now Hjorvar Steingrimsson is a player who actually competed in the Fischer Random World Chess Championship held in Reykjavik, I believe at the end of 2021, an event which I won. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So Magnus starts with e4. We get the move e5. Magnus plays knight f3. We get knight c6, bishop b5, and Steingrimsson decides to play the move a6 here rather than the Berlin defense, which is of course what Jurgis Pečák played against Magnus in the first round. So we get a6. Magnus plays bishop a4. We get knight to f6, and now we have the move pawn to d3 being played by Magnus. After d3, we get bishop to c5, and now we have this move c3. We get b5, bishop b3, and d6. Now I really do like Magnus's choice here, playing d3 with this closed Spanish, because generally what it does is black has to decide whether to play b5, bishop c5, and essentially it takes away any options like the open Spanish very specifically. So back to the game, we get bishop g5 from Magnus, h6, and bishop h4. Now one of the great things behind playing bishop g5 and bishop h4 in this position is that it's a little bit different than a very similar structure or position which occurs out of the classic Gucci piano. Now in the Gucci piano, one of the lines that is played a lot is this line with knight f6, c3, d6, where white castles, black plays something like a6, and white goes for a very early bishop g5, and after h6, bishop to h4. In some cases black can play g5 and a move like queen e7, bishop g4, etc., but it gets very, very sharp. Now in this position, when we look at this position as a comparison after bishop h4, black has already played b5 here, and one of the big differences is that if black wants to start attacking on the king side, let's just say bishop g4 for example, white has not castled the king, but furthermore, if you ever try to say castle queen side, white can play b4 and a4, attacking very, very quickly here. So in the game, Steingrimsson plays bishop to a7. We get the move knight bd2 from Magnus. We have g5, bishop g3, and now this move queen to e7 is played. Now the computer much prefers this move knight a5, going after this nice light square bishop on the diagonal, because after bishop c2, black can play c5 and try to contest the center right away. There might even be moves like knight to h5 to trade the knight for this dark square bishop on the g3 square. So instead, Steingrimsson plays queen to e7. We now get the move knight to f1, bishop to e6 is played, and now Magnus goes for knight e3. Now what Magnus has realized very early on here is that in this position, black has already pushed the pawns on the king side, so he's weakened the f5 square, essentially meaning that white with the knight on e3 can jump to either of these two squares, and it also stops any major threats for the dark square bishop on a7. So Steingrimsson plays rook b8, which is a strange move here. Honestly, I think it shows that he was a little bit out of sorts, wasn't sure what the plans were and what he should be going for. So he plays the move rook to b8. I think the main reason he played this is that if Magnus were to play a4, one second, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me, you guys. If Magnus were to play a4 here, he can maybe go b4 and try to play on the b file right away. So Magnus instead decides to castle here because he realizes that any ideas with pushing pawns on the king side really don't work. If black plays g4, white can go knight to h4 followed by knight to f5, and white is doing very, very well. And if black plays a move like h5 for example here, white can simply go h4, and after gh4, bishop h4, there's a very nasty pin here. And if black plays the move g4, now white can go knight g5, knight can jump to f5. There's a lot of pressure on the center of the board. If black takes on e3, suddenly you have the problem with this f file as well, so black is in a lot of trouble. So after castles, we get the move bishop takes e3, Magnus takes, and now Steingrimsson decides to castle, and Magnus goes knight d2. Now Magnus has a very nice position here, but there is one big issue he has, which is that black has pushed these pawns here, and white would love to get a knight to either of these two squares, f5 or d5, but you actually can't get the knight there because there's this pawn on e3. If you were magically able to get this position, just to illustrate it, something like this for example, with the knight on e3 here, white is actually close to winning because the knight again can jump to either of these two squares. So After knight d2, Magnus plays this move. I think the main reason is to guard the pawn on e4 so that white can push for d4. This bishop on g3 looks really nice, but it's staring at a bunch of pawns. So if you're able to get d4 in, you're putting a lot of pressure on the e5 point. The knight on d2 guards e4, and white has a clear advantage. So Steingrimson plays bishop g4, Magnus plays queen to e1, and now we have this move bishop h5. What Steingrimson is trying to do is put this bishop on g6 to put pressure on the pawn on e4. So if white were to play d4 after bishop g6, black is really pressuring the pawn on e4 here, and computer thinks that black might even be a little bit better. So Magnus plays knight back to f3, and now Steingrimson makes a huge mistake with this move king to g7. In this position, where does white want the knight? f5 or d5? Now here Steingrimson seems to have just overlooked a basic tactic, because what he should have played here was this move knight to d7 first, and then king g7 and bishop g6. And while white is still better, the game is very much alive. Instead, after king g7, Magnus can sack the knight with knight to h4 here, threatening to create the classic fork with knight to f5. And now Steingrimson regrettably has to play bishop g6. He cannot take what looks like a free horse, because after bishop takes pawn, suddenly you have all these issues with the knight and the queen on the diagonal, and the game is completely over. So we get bishop g6, Magnus plays knight to f5, bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, and now we have a situation where white has the two b's and black has these knights. Now in this situation, white is a lot better for the following reasons. The knights really don't have a lot of bastions or outposts in the center of the board. All these squares are covered. Additionally, white can stack on the f file, maybe creating a double or a triple stack, all the while also playing d4 to pressure the center. Now for people who are newer to the game, are probably wondering, what am I talking about? But we're going to see all of these themes in action. So Steingrimson plays knight to d7, retreating the knight, maybe ideas like knight c5, but also the idea to play f6 and just guard all these pawns in the center of the board. So after knight d7, we get queen to e2. Magnus obviously looking to go for the classic double stack on the f file. Steingrimson plays queen to e8 here, potentially intending to go knight to e7, and also meeting queen to h5 with f6 here, offering the trade of the queens. So in this position, we get rook a f1, Steingrimson plays f6, and now Magnus plays h4 here. Now what Magnus is doing by h4 is he does not want to trade the pawns right away, but black actually can't do anything with this pawn on g5. If you move the pawn, you hang a pawn. If you take on h4 after bishop takes, your pawn on f6 is under massive pressure, and you'll probably lose the game. So Magnus puts the pawn here, intending to take or push h5 down the road, but black always has to worry about these moves. So Steingrimson plays knight to e7, Magnus drops the rook back, we get to move knight to c5. Of course Magnus retreats the bishop because he needs to keep the two bishops on the board. Steingrimson plays knight g6, and now Magnus does play the move h5. Now Magnus could have traded on g5, and maybe this is okay as well, but after h takes g5 here, there are ideas like rook to h8 down the road, and it feels like you're opening a file for no reason. So we get h5. Steingrimson plays knight e7, and now Magnus pushes with d4 here because the bishop guards the pawn on e4. We get to move knight back to d7, and temporarily at least it looks like black is hanging on, but the problem is there's so much pressure and stress in the center of the board. The pawn on e5 is weak, the pawn on f6 is under attack down the road, and so black really can only sit here and hope that white can improve the position. So Magnus plays bishop b3, a very nice move here with the idea of bishop to e6, which will pressure this knight on d7, and black really can't do anything about it. So Steingrimson plays rook d8, and now instead of playing bishop e6 right away, Magnus plays a4 to try and also potentially open up the a file as well. Steingrimson decides here to go all in with f5. I think the reason that Steingrimson plays this move is because he feels like he's getting squeezed the way that a boa constrictor squeezes people and things and animals and plants and whatever, because basically black can't do anything much. If you play rook to b8 here, white can go bishop to e6. You can't really remove the bishop, and if you even play a move like knight c8, white can go queen g4 here, and after knight to b6, there's a5 to pressure the knight, and white is winning the game. And if you were to play like knight b6, for example here, now white can crash through by trading on e5 and sacking the rook with rook takes f6. After takes, bishop takes e5. Both of the bishops as well as the queen and the rook all play here, and black has these sad pieces, the rook and the two knights, that are simply boxed on the wrong side of the board. So Steingrimson figures he's going to die, or he's going to lose in a very painful, slow way, and he goes f5. And the reason behind playing f5 here is that what Steingrimson is hoping for in a perfect world is something like this, where after bishop c2 and knight to f6, the knight is actually blockading this pawn on f5. You guard e4, you hit h5, and maybe down the road black can even go rook b8 or queen d7 and rook c8, something like this. White is still much better, but the show goes on. Instead, Magnus decides to take on e5. Steingrimson takes with the knight, Magnus captures, and now we get this move king to f6 here, where Steingrimson says you shall not pass. He's blockading with the king, and it actually on first glance looks kind of interesting because Magnus has no knights. If Magnus had a knight that could go to e4, it would win. If a knight could go to g4, it would win, but Magnus only has bishops on the board, so temporarily Steingrimson is hanging on for dear life. So here Magnus goes bishop to e6, guarding the pawn on f5. Doesn't really do anything specifically other than prevent black from ever capturing the pawn. We get the move queen to c6. Magnus trades the pawns on b5 and now goes queen to d1. And the main thing is actually that this game is very similar to his game against Dragunov yesterday, where Dragunov had the two bishops and was unable to open up the position in time. And Magnus knows here that because the king is stuck here, knight is stuck here, eventually what he needs to do is open up some diagonals for the two b's. So we get a5 from Steingrimson. Magnus goes b3. We get rook to b8, and now he plays this move rook to a2 here because the bishop on e6 guards both of the pawns very neatly, and white wants to go after this pawn on a5. So we get knight 7 c6 from Steingrimson. Magnus plays the move pawn to e4 here, another nice move, simply guarding the pawn on f5, and also Magnus can try to reactivate the bishop via the f2 and d4 square on another diagonal. So we get queen to c5. Magnus plays bishop f2, and Steingrimson captures this pawn. Now, I don't really fault him for capturing, but what's happening here is that the position is starting to open up. The bishops have some nice diagonals. White is getting some open files. There's pressure on the a file. There's also pressure on the c file down the road, and it really feels like it's just a question of when Magnus will be able to break through. So we get rook to c2. Steingrimson plays queen b4, and now Magnus plays bishop to d5, putting maximum pressure on the knight as well as the pawn on c7. And of course, when you have a pawn chain, if the base of the chain collapses, let's say black plays knight a7 and this hangs, the d6 pawn is going to fall very, very soon as well. So we get knight to e7 from Steingrimson. Really the only move here, if you were to play queen b5, for example, there are many ways for white to win. Probably the simplest one is something like queen to a1, making full use of all the diagonals here and the pressure on the c file, and white is just overwhelmingly winning. So we get knight e7 instead. Magnus plays rook takes pawn. We get rook fc8 here. Steingrimson still desperately trying to trade off some pieces, because if he can get to this position here, maybe he's okay. He's still down a pawn, but the king and the knights are on the dark squares. This bishop isn't doing anything on d5, and maybe there's still a faint glimmer of hope. Instead, Magnus plays rook to a7 here, keeping the rooks on the board. There's no rook a8 because the bishop covers the a8 square here, and with this rook on the 7th rank and a kebab, it's very, very much dire straits for black. So Steingrimson plays rook to c3, and here Magnus goes bishop to c4, a very nice move, basically trapping the rook on c3. White has ideas like bishop e1 or bishop d4, all the while pressuring this pawn on d6. So after bishop to c4, Steingrimson plays rook to b6, trying to guard this pawn on d6, but now Magnus goes bishop d4, and you can tell that the b's combined with the rook, combined with the pressure on the d file, are simply too much. Steingrimson plays rook takes c4. We get b takes c4, and now after knight 7 c6, Magnus plays this move rook to h7, and here Steingrimson resigns the game because Magnus is going to win the h6 pawn, and once he wins this h6 pawn, then both the f and the h pawns, also affectionately known as the wide pipos, will both start moving up the board, creating more space for the queen and the rooks. So after rook to h7, Steingrimson abandons the game. Magnus wins a very nice game, a very instructive game, showing how you use the two b's or the two bishops very, very effectively. And so it's just a very, very nice win after an extremely shaky game yesterday from Magnus. Now, unfortunately for Magnus, this might be good news, but it could also be bad news. Bad news. Norway did lose the match to Iceland by a score of 2.5 to 1.5. I believe on boards 2 and board 4, they lost their games. So Norway loses by a score of 2.5, 1.5 to Iceland. What that means for Magnus is probably good. However, because Magnus will probably get easier pairings since Norway is struggling so mightily in the event, which gives Magnus more opportunities to boost his already boosted classical rating, potentially getting as high as maybe 2840 by the end of the event. So we will have to wait and see what happens. At any rate, for Magnus, a great game, very instructive. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back tomorrow with another recap from the European Team Chess Championship. I'm not sure if I'll just cover a Magnus game or maybe a couple of games depending on how Norway does, because Magnus does play weaker players. It might not be as interesting, but at any rate, I thought this game was very instructive. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys very, very soon here on YouTube. Have a great one. Peace out. Bye.